And good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Hoops HD Report, coming to you live on tape delay here, December 26th, Boxing Day. Big huge day in college basketball today, everybody, as the huge game between Morgan State and Loyola Marymount is going on as we record this. But my name is Chad Sherwood. I'm your host. Off to my side here is David Griggs, who made his bed this time.
Well, I didn't. Oh, my staff does that.
Down below,
that was a bed and breakfast in New Hampshire.
They were. It's not that they threw me out; it's that they didn't have an open reservation.
Down below, we got John Stalika, John Titel with us as well. We've got a lot we want to get to tonight. Not just a review of last week's games and a preview of next week's games, but a couple of topics. We're going to do a section a little later on about in-conference rivalries, as conference play is going to be kicking off, at least in the Big Ten, starting tomorrow, Tuesday the 27th. And we are also going to be hitting on a few other topics that have been in the news recently. Going to get to North Carolina in a second, but before that, David, I know you don't want to do it, but today is
there's a lot of stuff we want to get to. This is something that we don't want to get to.
Today is Boxing Day, not Kickboxing Day, though, which Grayson Allen's become an expert at. It happened last week in the game against Elon. At least last year was games Louisville, Florida State, games that mean something. It came against Elon. Steven Santana got tripped by Grayson Allen, becoming the third time. David, Coach K, a little hesitant at first and then suspends him indefinitely.
I think Coach K is about as excited about this as I am, and that's that he just doesn't want to have to deal with it, is what it comes down to. I don't know. It's not what I like to be discussing because there isn't really anything. I like discussing on-the-court issues and things like that, and then here we are talking about something kind of silly, but yet it warrants discussion. It's the third time in about 11 months that he's tripped a player. Each time he did it, it was on purpose and out of frustration. And again, after the incident, he apologizes all over himself. And I don't really know how to feel about it, which is, I mean, I know you went to me first. Part of me is like, why can't we just kind of get on and forget about this? And why do we have to talk about it all? And another part of me understands that it isn't a big deal and it does need to stop. But isn't it am I wrong in feeling that this is kind of Duke's issue and only Duke's issue, and Duke should handle it the way Duke feels that they should handle it, or the ACC, or whoever it is that handles it? Or maybe he should just keep doing it every game and just become the ultimate bad guy wrestler of basketball.
Well, John T., let me begin here. Do you think that Duke and Coach K are handling this properly? Do you think it should be more, or should be, I guess we don't know how many games it's going to be yet, but do you think it should have been, something like, hey, he's going to be out a month, he's going to be out 5 games, something like that?
So a couple of things there. I was surprised there was an indefinite suspension. I assumed it was going to be anywhere from 1 to 5 games and then move on with our lives. But to leave it open like this, I mean, every single day that he doesn't come back on the practice and/or game court, I think the plot thickens and thickens. In terms of their upcoming schedule, they have 3 road games coming up in, I believe, January. The next 3, Virginia Tech, Florida State, Louisville. That could be 3 tourney teams. So even though he's not their best player this year, I think it's Luke Kennard by a mile. You could really use him. The fact that it has been the 3rd incident in 11 months gives me some concern in that maybe, to David's point, it is up to Duke to handle internally. But when you fail to handle it in February when he trips Louisville's Ray Spalding, when you fail to handle it again in February when he trips Florida State guard Xavier Can-Mays, then it becomes outside your problem and somebody else has to handle it.
Yeah, Sleek, let me bring you in here on this as well. It's actually the first game of the conference plays, or next game at Virginia Tech. Back-to-back home games after that with Georgia Tech and BC before the Florida State and Louisville road games. Do you think he's back by that second batch of road games, or do you think there's going to be something more with this?
I think we focus a lot on the trips, and I think, as John T. pointed out, by not doing anything the second time, that really opened the door for who knows what to happen. But I think another point that we're not bringing up is if you saw the temper tantrum he threw after he was caught tripping during the Elon game and his reaction with John Shire on the bench, Is anyone really buying the notion that Coach K didn't find out about that until after the game?
No. Let me ask you this. As far as how it was handled during the game, if I'm the coach, and I'm not, but if I were, the player would not have returned in a game. And I hate to sound kind of selfish, but especially not against an Elan team that you're probably going to beat without them pretty easily anyway. If there's ever an opportunity to send a message and not really get burned, it would be there. But as far as the rules go, and I know the rules enough to watch the games, how does this not fit the definition of a flagrant 2? And if it doesn't, should it? I mean, when you intentionally trip a player that's been by you, you're not making a basketball play, and you're obviously doing it to harm the other person. I mean, it's not the same as punching someone, but shouldn't this be an ejection? He should have been ejected from all 3 games, in my opinion.
And I'd agree with you there. I think that's a great point that some of this does go to the officials for not stopping play, reviewing it, and throwing him out of the game.
Yeah.
And I think that the officials should. I mean, you hate to say that they should base it on past behavior, but this is a kid who's done a choice before. It's not like, this was like the first time. Maybe it was just something, the heat of the moment, the first time ever, one little mess up. This is a guy now with a proven history of.
Yeah.
And then there was one other thing that happened when Duke had a return game to Louisville last year. There was another scrum where Allen was fighting for a loose ball, and it looked like for a moment that a Louisville player had thrown an elbow at Allen. You have to wonder if that, to some extent, might have been vigilante justice because, remember, Louisville was banned itself from the postseason. It's not like they had anything else to lose at that point. You would hate – if the Duke and the ACC don't step in, I'd hate to see what happens if some other team decides to take matters into their own hands here.
Well, let's stick in the ACC with the other big news that came out of the other half. We're going to get to rivalries in a bit, and Duke, North Carolina is definitely one we're going to discuss. Let's talk about a little North Carolina. It was the other major news story off the court as the NCAA issued their 3rd different notice of allegations to North Carolina, calling it actually a second amended notice of allegations, let's say 3rd one. But the NCAA had originally issued the notice of allegations complaining of issues related to basically fake courses, more or less, with men's and women's basketball and football. They then was a amended notice of allegations that removed the football and the men's basketball. A hearing back a few months ago done by Greg Sankey from the SEC, who apparently then came out at the end of this hearing and said, you know what, based on the evidence that I heard and what I heard in this hearing, you should have kept all these allegations, asked the NCAA to re-amend it, and now basketball and football are back in it again. John T., let me start with you. Is this North Carolina story going to be a story that's not going to go away for a long time? Because I've got a feeling that North Carolina is going to fight this, and is going to fight this as far as they can fight it.
I agree that they're going to fight it. I think it might actually, in some weird way, become a non-story the more this goes on, in terms of if we come back in 2019 and we're up to our 29th notice of allegations, at that point I'm going to start getting a little bored with it. I'll be the first to admit that. It also teaches me that bad things happen in threes in the ACC, 3 trips, 3 notices of allegations. I'm sensing a theme here. I don't know nobody knows what the ultimate outcome is going to be, but yeah, if they were not going to fight it, I assume they would have caved already to get the ball rolling on whatever probation, suspension, whatever would happen. I think they're going to fight it.
Well, John, let me stick with you for a second here, actually, because the big issue that North Carolina, my understanding is that they're fighting it on, is jurisdictional issue, and that is the idea that that they have punished the professors and the people that were running these courses, and that's none of the NCAA's damn business. They need to be dealing with the stuff on the court and on the field of play and eligibility of individual players, but this bigger university issue is not their business. And if this ends up going into a court system, let's say it ends up all the way in the United States Supreme Court, whether or not the NCAA has jurisdiction to do this, and the NCAA loses, is the next step saying, well, how much authority does the NCAA have to ban players for grades? How much authority does the NCAA have to, let's talk about the APR system here, where we are looking at grades and throwing teams out of postseason play. Maybe that's not outside their jurisdiction as well.
I was going to say, ask Hawaii how much jurisdiction they have in March when they want to, but will not be able to play in the NCAA tourney. It also strikes me as comparable to the Duke situation in terms of, in North Carolina, we are letting you know that something is a problem, fix it. And if you're not going to fix it after a couple of times, maybe they're going to come in after the fact, be it the third time, fourth time, et cetera, and say, no, we don't trust you to fix it. It's one thing if it was just like one class with one player. It seems to be a systemic, huge problem, and kudos to the Tar Heels for any steps they've taken to fix it, to make sure it doesn't happen going forward. But the NCAA is not going away. It's pretty clear at this point. So I think that the Tar Heels better play ball, otherwise it could end up in a long, ugly court battle.
And let me ask you this from a legal perspective, and I know that you all have a lot of legal experience from defending me. Legally, what is the NCAA's role here? Because from an accreditation issue, the NCAA doesn't play a role at all. They're not an accrediting agency, and they can't really dictate how easy or hard or rigorous or light an academic load is. Now, what happened at North Carolina on the institutional level was rather egregious. It was basically an entire academic department that pitched a tent and threw in the towel and was basically offering these these classes with no instruction, no assignment, no grading, and collecting their paychecks and going home. But the issue is it wasn't just open the athletes. And that reason alone, I don't think you can get them for extra benefits, because had it been a course where nobody in the course, where none of the students were regular students and they were all athletes, that's one thing. But these were open to the entire student body, and you had students graduating with African American studies degrees that weren't athletes, that never took a real class. So is that the accrediting agency? Yes. Do they need to go in there and clean that up? Yes. Is that a problem? Yes. But what can the NCAA really do about it? At what point do we stop turning to the NCAA for things that really aren't athletics issues? I don't consider this an athletic issue. I consider this a serious problem at the institutional level that Saxcock, who's the accrediting agency of the South, needs to get in there and handle. But the NCAA has about as much room to operate here as you and I do.
Yeah, and so that's exactly, David, what North Carolina's position is in this entire thing, which is why I think this is a fight that's going to go on forever. Stalika, you have a few thoughts?
I think you have to take a closer look at that allegation. It's because one of the things that they're saying is they're saying student athletes got preferential access to these courses and seminars that regular students would not get. So that's where you get the extra benefit here. And one of the other key things is they also moved the time frame from the second notice of amended allegations. It was at that point, I think, fall of 2005, and now they rolled it back to fall 2002, which puts football and men's basketball under the gun for that time. I mean, at what point are they going to take a page in Miami's book and just say, well, maybe we'll just take ourselves out of the postseason for a couple of years, because people are going to be recruiting negatively against North Carolina for the foreseeable future, because they don't know when Thor's hammer is going to come hammering down against them.
I do want to throw one little point out here, though, one last point here. Bubba Cunningham, the AD at North Carolina, was very critical about the fact that they threw these extra charges back in after this hearing. And he said that this was akin to a jury listening to arguments from both sides at a trial and then urging the prosecution to return with a stronger case. In my opinion, actually, that is exactly what can happen in front of a grand jury if you're talking about criminal law. In the criminal law context, a grand jury can hear a case in which the prosecution urges one type of penalty and say, hey, state, we find there's other problems here. We want to launch our own inquiry. We want to go ahead and get out there and issue additional penalties to this person for this crime that we believe was committed. So I don't really agree with Bubba Cunningham that, and North Carolina decided to submit to this early hearing, this jurisdictional hearing that normally doesn't happen. I think they got to live with the results, whether they like it or not. But again, in the end of the day, though, I'm kind of agreeing with David that I think North Carolina has a serious case here as to whether or not this really is something that the NCAA should be getting involved in.
Yeah, and I realize we don't want to spend too much more time on this, but just something to think about. The athletic department doesn't really have a whole lot of say over what the academic calendar, or not calendar, but curriculum is. You can't really go to a professor and say, I don't feel your class is tough enough, or I feel your class is too tough. Nor can you tell a student, and I know it happens most of the time on the other end of things, but you can't just tell a student, well, I'm not going to permit you to take that class. So I guess, now, again, in saying that, I wasn't there. I don't know all the specifics. What was the athletic department really supposed to do here?
Well, I understand, and I agree with you, actually. So I think this is something that's going to play out over the next, as John T. said, maybe over the next several years, with many multiple amended. But I think that North Carolina is not going to cave into this, and I think it's going to be set up an interesting legal fight in the future that we'll probably be discussing many times coming through the next couple of years here. But
and just so you understand my position, this is a problem, but I consider it an institutional problem. Like if Roy Williams went to the provost and blew the whistle and said, these classes are jokes and they're ridiculous, you need to do something about it, he would have been thrown out of the provost's office.
No, he's Roy Williams.
Well,
think about that. Let's actually turn to the games on the court, though, and as opposed to the stuff that was off the court. And as we go on the court here, probably the best game this past week in terms of both its national significance and the way the game was played was the Kentucky-Louisville game. Louisville coming up with a huge 73-70 win on the road at UK. John T., let me start with you. Did you get a chance to see the game? And
it was at Louisville, Chad.
That's why I said it was at Louisville.
You said it was at UK.
Well, I meant to say it was at Louisville.
Okay, well.
Okay. I guess I was wrong. Huh,
it was at Louisville, Chad. Gee, Chad, all these people watching, and you just completely messed that up.
John T., did you get a chance to see the game?
Chad, you just kind of mess up that whole thing like that.
We're going to go back and edit that, David.
So, yes, I did get to watch the game. I had the week off from work for the most part, so I got to go to a bar and watch it with my friend Alicia. It was a great game, close throughout. Some of the things that caught my eye were that Louisville only had 5 players who ended up scoring in the game. I think that's some cause for concern. Obviously, if it's good enough to beat Kentucky, it's good enough to beat anybody. So, good sign. But I think they need a little more depth and a little more help from the bench. Additionally, Kentucky kind of shot themselves in the foot by shooting the ball poorly. 5 of 22 from three-point range, 19 of 29 from the line. When you lose by 3 points and you miss 10 free throws, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do the math. So, great game, very competitive in Louisville. I think both teams will go far in March, and it was a good game.
Yeah, and David, I know you were a big fan of this rivalry here. I think that you feel it's one of the best rivalries in the country, but I think are we sold down with this Louisville team going forward?
I think so, and I think it's a game they needed to win for their mental health. Kentucky had absolutely dominated this series coming into it, and how meaningful was it on paper? In reality, not very. I mean, it's a chance to get a really high-quality win on your resume, but it's not a conference game. It's often not a bad loss. There isn't really so much of a risk-reward here, so it's more of the bragging rights off paper that really make this rivalry, but yeah, I think it solidifies Louisville, but in a weird way, and I know that it didn't feel good to lose, I actually think it solidifies Kentucky as well. It was their first true road game. It was a very hostile environment against a really good team, and they didn't shoot well and they missed free throws, and they still were right in there with a chance to win right down to the last second. They actually had a shot in the final seconds that would have tied the game and sent it to overtime. So in looking at Kentucky moving forward, do they have a game more difficult than that on their schedule? Probably not. So I think it really solidifies both teams.
Well, Salika, let me bring you in here. A couple of things that did happen this past week. There were a pair of tournaments that were noteworthy to an extent, or maybe not noteworthy, and maybe that's my question. Diamond Head Classic, we discussed it last week. The field very weak this year. San Diego State does become the first saving grace for the Mountain West, I think, all season by winning the event. But is this enough to do anything to save San Diego State's season, or was this field just too weak?
Probably not so much for San Diego State, but it also gives San Francisco a couple wins and sort of gives them a little bit of momentum as far as a fourth wheel goes in the West Coast Conference. They're not going to challenge Gonzaga or St. Mary's, but I think the question here is, can they challenge BYU?
I think any challenge to BYU would be for a 3 seed in a conference tournament where only the top 2 seeds are going to be looking like NCAA teams, in my opinion. But yes, I think that I agree with you. I think San Fran can challenge BYU this year. John T., the other event, 4-team Las Vegas Classic, won by USC, who's still undefeated, and I would have to call it won in unimpressive fashion over bad competition.
Couldn't agree more. 13-0, it's 13-0, but a 2-point overtime win over Wyoming in a neutral site is iffy at best. The thing that impresses me is that this team has room for improvement. They pretty much have a 7-man rotation with Benny Boatwright injured. None of the 7 are seniors. So I think they're going to win 20 and make the tourney this year, but I don't think a lot of them are going to jump to the draft. So I think next year they're going to be like even much better.
Okay, I'll agree with you there because I've mentioned a few times that I'm very unimpressed with USC despite the record, and but next year could be something special for them. I agree with that.
So you're not impressed that they were able to beat what might be a Mountain West frontrunner?
Actually, San Diego State is now with the Diamond win. Don't you know, David?
I think they're also a front range runner now.
Yeah.
David, the other game that is probably the most shocking game of this past week,
boy.
And we've got to do this. Syracuse at home against a pathetically bad St. John's team with, I believe, one of their worst home losses at the Carrier Dome ever.
It was the worst loss at the Carrier Dome.
It was. I mean, if you had told me last week that the final score for the Syracuse St. John's game was going to be 93-60,
I wouldn't.
If you had told 100 other people that also, all 101 of us would have said Syracuse won the game, right?
Yes, yeah. I think Syracuse. I mean, if this was like a video game, if they were just playing Madden or something, and this had happened, you just turn it off and start over. Maybe that's what Syracuse should do. It's just try again next year.
Yeah, and John T, are we beyond panic mode for the Orange at this point?
We are. When your 5 losses are to top 100 teams and you have a good ACC schedule ahead of you with quality wins to get, you're still hanging around. But the fact that you're letting a couple of freshmen like Marcus Levet and Shamori Pons just dominate the whole game from start to finish, I don't think they're making the tourney, but they're going to need a lot of help in ACC play to do it.
It seems almost comical to think now that a few weeks ago, Syracuse and UConn turned out to be fighting for who could get to the reset button first.
Speaking of UConn, they suffered a loss this past week, losing at home to Auburn in a game we really thought that Auburn needed. This, I think this was a nice win for this Auburn team. And Salika, another loss this past week, South Carolina going down again, this time losing to Clemson. Are we seeing it again from Angry Frank's team that they just get off that great start and just start to collapse?
I think Joby had warned us last week that South Carolina seemed to be padding their win column. I mean, their best wins like Michigan and Syracuse aren't looking quite as great. But I thought you were going to get into Providence and Boston College, which unbelievably, for the second time in 3 years, BC has been a thorn in Providence's side, and they're going to be completely sputtering into their Big East opener against Xavier in a couple days now.
BC's showing a little bit of life here, I guess.
A little bit. Syracuse is not doing well against their old Big East rivals. Just since they've renewed. They beat UConn last year on a neutral floor. I think that's the only – and they've beaten Nova in the past. But if you consider Nova to be an old Big East rival, that may be just an old Big East opponent. But against UConn and St. John's, oh, boy. And it's just Georgetown, it's just not going well.
And John T., one other game I want to bring up here. The Virginia Cavaliers went all the way out west to take on Cal. Came up with it was a good game, a close game, a 4-point win out there. Well, I won't say it's a good game. It was a close game, though. It was a painful game to watch. But if you sit up to watch it and suffer through it, how big of a win is this for this Virginia team being able to pick up that game?
Medium. I don't think it's a great win because Cal is underwhelming me so far this year. Cavaliers only made 8 free throws and only had 1 steal the whole game. I thought their whole team was based on defense. I thought this was right for the upset. But when you only turn the ball over 7 times and hold your opponent to 35% shooting, you're going to win a lot of games, be it on the East Coast or the West Coast.
All right. Well, on that note, because there was so few games with obviously nothing much of the last 3 days here, we wanted to hit another topic tonight altogether. And with the couple of good rivalries we had this past week, like Clemson, South Carolina, and Kentucky, Louisville.
And Rutgers, Seton Hall.
And Rutgers, Seton Hall, the probably one of the least heated in-state rivalries out there in the battle for this to see who's the second best team in the state of New Jersey. Go Monmouth. But we want to go through the conferences here, go through at least the 10 multi-bid conferences that we do discuss in this podcast. And my question to each of you is going to be, what do you think the best or the top 2 or 3 in some cases rivalry is in these conferences as we go into conference play? And David, I'm going to start off with you in the ACC, and I think we can mention Duke, North Carolina, and the fact that they've never played in the NCAA tournament and move on because clearly I think everyone would consider that number 1 in the ACC. But beyond that, what do you have?
And it is kind of the staple rivalry. And I guess my question, and I guess we'll get into this, is what constitutes a rivalry? Is it importance? Is it heat and venom? Because Louisville, Kentucky, often of very little, if any, importance, but extremely heated. Duke and North Carolina, often very important, with it being a conference game, affecting the standings and seedings and everything else. The best ACC, I mean, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, I would say Duke and Maryland, but that's no longer an ACC rivalry. One of the ones that I kind of like, and I know that this might be an odd one to pick, but I love the atmosphere at the game, and it is sort of a David versus Goliath, and it involves an up-and-coming program against what's become a regular protected seed program. I think this Virginia Tech-Virginia rivalry is been one of the most fun to watch the last couple of years, and it's one that I'm especially looking forward to this year with Virginia Tech finally looking like a tournament caliber team.
And if you pay attention to the AP poll, Virginia Tech actually made their debut in the top 25 under Buzz Williams.
Yeah.
Yeah. And John T., let me throw it over to you there. David raised an interesting point. What makes a rivalry? I mentioned the lack of heat, for example, between Rutgers and Seton Hall because Rutgers has been pathetic the last 20 years, and it's tough to get a rivalry when you have one team that just isn't that good. So do you have an answer to him what constitutes a rivalry? And then the second half of the question is, what do you like in the ACC beyond those matchups?
So I think you have to go back to the cliche of familiarity breeds contempt. We always love the Louisville-Kentucky rivalry, but as we've pointed out, I think many times in the past, when you only play once a year, obviously sometimes they match up in March. It's hard to get it going. But when you play a team 3 or 4 times due to 2 in the regular season, 1 in the ACC tourney, and 1 in the postseason perhaps, that's how you get it going. That's why even though Carolina and Duke don't meet in March every year, it's because they played so long and so bloody battles and so close to each other. In terms of other rivalries, one I want to see is kind of a newish rivalry in that there's no familiarity because they weren't in the ACC even until recently, is Notre Dame and Louisville. I think one way you can create a rivalry out of thin air is to have an event kind of be a cause for even more contempt. And a couple of years ago, 2013, they played their famous 5 overtime game that Notre Dame won. I hope that was going to be a jumping off point. It hasn't yet. They're both playing great this year. I think consensus top 25 teams. Everybody thinks they're both going to make again, hopefully 4 times this year.
Stalika, let me throw it over to you. Is there another matchup here in the ACC that you think is a great rivalry?
We probably don't hear about it too much, but I also think Notre Dame and North Carolina is another one that you can throw in because they've also met in the ACC tournament the past couple of years. Notre Dame actually won the ACC title in 2015, and North Carolina paid them back big time last year by just completely blasting them en route to their ACC title, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But another game I kind of keep an eye on is Miami and Florida State, because the Hurricanes have been probably better than what we've expected in their time in the ACC, and Florida State, I mean, they have upended Miami a couple times, but they haven't had nearly the success in postseason that Miami has had in recent memory.
And that's a great point because that's a good football rivalry and maybe hasn't been there in basketball, but I think it's one that can get there. And when you have these great football rivalries, they can very often turn into a great basketball rivalry or vice versa. One other, I guess, that I would throw in there is I don't think it's really a rivalry yet, but I think network TV wants it to become one, and that's Duke versus Syracuse.
Yeah, I was about to make the comment that no one mentioned that and celebrate the fact that no one mentioned it because it's not a rivalry, it's a showcase game, and then you mentioned it. Thanks a lot, Chad.
Sorry.
It's a funny thing that Chad talks about football rivalries. There was one thing I never knew until I saw the 30 for 30 on Catholics versus convicts. The same year that Miami blew out Notre Dame in football, Digger Phelps repaid the favor in basketball, and the Notre Dame team that wound up getting a 3 seed that year completely blasted Miami on the road.
Let's move over to the Big East here. And when you talk about rivalries in the Big East, you have 5 teams I think are the old classic Big East teams: Providence, Villanova, Georgetown, St. John's, Seton Hall, along with 5 newer bloods like Xavier, Creighton, Butler. John T., do you think we have anything with the newer bloods, or do you think we got to go to one of these old blood matchups, I guess?
I mean, when you have 2 teams meet in one of the famous NCAA finals ever, even 30 years later, you have to go with Villanova-Georgetown. There is some chance for recency in terms of, I like that Villanova and Butler have had a lot of recent success in March, and now that they're in the same conference, they can keep having success while battling each other during the season. I wish eventually it's going to be good, but like my Notre Dame-Louisville comparison, it's going to take time. It's not like Butler and Xavier and Creighton were all fantastic teams, all came over from the same conference. They all were from different places. Now that they're there, if they can stick around for a while, I think it'll be great. But right now it's Villanova-Georgetown, I think, by a lot.
Yeah, what's interesting, Chad, it's just, well, one of the things I noticed last year when Villanova won the national title was how happy the rest of the Big East seemed to be for them. And I mention that because while the Big East has a lot of great games and great matchups and great showcases, there seems to be a lack of venom. Like, you shouldn't be happy when one of your rivals wins the national title. You should be disgusted and hating life. I just don't think the Big East has a whole lot of heat yet, minus maybe Nova and Georgetown.
And I think part of it is that the Big East, I think at times has felt like they're almost the stepchild to the other 5 conferences because they're not a football conference. And I think last year's championship by Villanova really said, hey, Big East, it is 6 conferences, not 5. And that may be part of that. But I agree with you. It's, maybe something like a St. John, Seton Hall, still might be there. Stalika, Xavier, DePaul, huge rivalry, right?
Not DePaul, but you would probably think that the 2 rivalries that would be coming out eventually are going to be Xavier and Butler, which go back to the clock game in 2010. But also keep an eye on Xavier Creighton because both teams have been playing spoiler against each other for the past 3 years, depending on who is seated higher. I think the stakes are going to be higher this year just because both teams have been in the top 10 at one point.
I think for it to become the great rivalry, you kind of need that event, though. And I know this is going to dip a little bit under the radar here, but a couple of years ago in the WAC, there was a huge fight between Utah Valley and New Mexico State. It was an ugly incident. Fans getting in there, punching players while they were storming the court. That's the type of thing that, well, I'm not saying we needed more events like that. That's the type of thing that builds a rivalry and can make something, and can help you build the heat, even when you get 2 teams that are been in a conference together for 3 or 4 years, and that's it.
Yeah, and what John Stalika was talking about, Xavier and Butler, while not in the same conference, played regularly, or they had signed a 6-year deal or something. And it was at the time when Butler was really starting to become ranked and nationally relevant. Xavier went there, and there was a clock mishap. You might recall the game where there was a tipped ball, and the person operating the clock made the mistake of thinking the referee was signaling for a timeout. So he stopped the clock, and essentially for the rest of the final 2 minutes of the game, the clock was 3 seconds off. And Butler hits a go-ahead shot and with 3 seconds left, and it looks like Xavier's lining up for the last play, and then suddenly the refs come out and say the game is over, and Chris Mack and all of Xavier goes absolutely ballistic. Those are the kinds of things that can kind of stick in your craw and create a rivalry. A little bit better story than just a bench-clearing brawl with fans that Chad brought.
Let's go over to the Big Ten. And David, let me stick with you here as we start the Big Ten. And I know you want to talk about the Rutgers-Nebraska rivalry, but let's go beyond that and talk about what else we've got here. And is it the big football one, or is there something else when we talk about basketball?
I think with basketball, there's a lot of good ones here. It's hard to – I think Michigan State, Michigan's really heated. Indiana, Purdue is certainly heated. Iowa, Minnesota, they kind of get after it a little bit in basketball. I think this conference, of all the major ones, I think the Pac-12 and the Big Ten have the best rivalry within it. Ohio State, Michigan, another one. I know it's more of a football rivalry, but this one has some good ones.
John T., is there anything else there that you want to throw in here with the Big Ten?
I think this conference actually stands out as having the most rivalries just because of tradition. They've been around a long time. They keep bringing in great teams like Rutgers. And the fact that they have so many good teams like Indiana, Purdue, in-state rivalry, two great teams that should go far in March this year. Amazing rivalry. And you could argue it's not even in the top 5 between all the other amazing ones. Michigan, Ohio State is a big football rivalry. And some years it transcends to basketball as well. And this year with the Spartans on a downswing, I think it might rise up again. But Michigan State's won a lot of titles. Ohio State's won a lot of titles. There's just so much goodness to pick from.
Indiana and Illinois is another rivalry that used to be pretty heated during the 80s, although that's cooled off in recent years because of their injury mishaps over the past few years.
Yeah, and then you have again, some football ones like Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's tough to say Northwestern anybody, but Northwestern Illinois has a chance to become a rivalry, even though they've been playing in the same conference since time began. But
I thought the puppet was going to argue that Michigan State and Nebraska is going to be a budding rivalry now.
Oh, well, budding, it's already there.
I thought it was Rutgers, Nebraska again for last place, but let me move over to the Big 12. And Salika, let me start with you here. With another conference where I do think we have some old classic rivalries that have been around for a while.
One that used to be around that's not anymore, the best one ever.
Kansas and Kansas State is still there. I mean, granted, it's pretty one-sided.
Yeah.
Well, Salika, is that the best rivalry in the Big 12, or do you have something else better than that?
I would probably go with Kansas and Texas. I mean, when you consider how good both teams have been within the past 10 to 15 years. Probably the best well-played rivalry last year was Kansas and Oklahoma, especially the front end that was played at Kansas.
Well, I think when it comes to basketball, this Kansas-Oklahoma is one that has some history to it as well. John T., would you agree with me there?
It does. I remember when the 88 Final Four, I believe, when Oklahoma ruined my year and then lost to Kansas and Danny and the Miracles. I would argue that this conference, amongst all the others, has the least rivalries because, frankly, the past decade, it's Kansas against the rest of the conference because they've been so much better than the rest of the conference. I know when Texas is good, Texas and Kansas go right at. Texas might lose 20 games this year. I mean, it's just not there.
Well, David, what about some of the football matchups like Bedlam between Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, or Oklahoma versus Texas?
Yeah, well, Bedlam is, I mean, I know that's mainly known for football, but that's a great basketball rivalry as well. And one of the ones that's kind of gotten heated more so in basketball than football even is this Baylor-Texas series. I mean, I think that one's, if I had to, when it comes to heat, I think those two would be at the top of my list. Kansas State one that as good of a rivalry as it is, I don't know if the hatred is there.
I mean, that's probably hatred, but if you're also looking for one that's pretty competitive, Baylor and Iowa State is also kind of on the undercard because Baylor was the only team that had won at Hilton consistently over the past couple years.
Well, John T., when we talk about the Big 12, I want to just mention this West Virginia team because of all the teams that have moved conferences recently, I think that this team has had probably the most difficult, especially on the basketball side, fitting in with its conference. And I just don't see anybody being the heated rival of West Virginia.
True. I think it'll take time since, again, going back to the Notre Dame-Louisville thing, when you're the new kid in town, you got to knock off the sheriff in Kansas. But if there's any year to do it, this might be the year. Obviously, with a bunch of I believe 5 one-loss teams, one of which is West Virginia, and an undefeated Baylor team, it is going to be some tough shredding and shedding and sledding in the Big 12. But give it time. I mean, it's also nobody likes to watch West Virginia, the thing where they turn you over 25 times a night. But Huggins himself, a pair of Hall of Famers, I could watch that all night.
I guess kind of my point here, though, was when you bring a Notre Dame and a Syracuse into the ACC, it's such a big name that everyone wants to go out to the beach. You know, Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech, they're excited about playing Notre Dame. It's just like, David, didn't even see that excitement for West Virginia coming in.
Right, and I am drawing up a petition to try and make some changes here. What we're going to do, West Virginia's rivals are Virginia, Virginia Tech, Pittsburgh, so we're going to send them to the ACC. We're going to take Louisville, and we're going to put them in the SEC, and we're going to take Missouri, and we're going to put them back in the Big 12 in place of Virginia.
Actually, I would agree with that, believe it or not. I hate to agree with you, David, but this is one time I would.
Yeah.
Let's move over to the Pac-12. And Tytel, let me bring you back in here again. What is the best basketball rivalry in the Pac-12?
It is Arizona against the Bruins, and it is not even close based on their history. However, I understand that LA, the battle from Westwood against Watts, UCLA, USC, they could meet up in January, both undefeated, and the college basketball world, at least west of the Mississippi, would go ballistic. But until then, it is Arizona, UCLA.
All right. Well, Salika, I mean, the Pac-12 is really set up for rivalries, though, with Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, Washington State, Arizona, Arizona State, Cal and Stanford. Is there something else here after this UCLA, Arizona, maybe in terms of the crossovers, as opposed to the ones that are kind of your travel partners here?
I don't think we need to worry about the Pacific Northwest this year. But Colorado and Utah has actually been one of my favorites that has come up in recent years, although I think there have been occasional non-conference matchups between the two when Colorado was in the Big 12 and Utah was in the WAC/Mountain West.
Well, David, any other thoughts on the Pac-12?
I think UCLA Arizona is definitely the showcase rivalry. Now, I've never been immersed in the Pac-12. I don't see that one being the most heated, though, even if that is the biggest. I've always thought this. I mean, in Stanford and Cal, the mascots on 2 occasions have gotten in the brawls. That's pretty heated.
Now, Stanford and Arizona, if I'm not mistaken, there was some heat to that rivalry when the Cardinal were actually contesting for 1 seeds. I think that was back around 2001 and 2004.
Yeah, and I think maybe the problem is that Stanford did not maintain that level of success, and Arizona did, and that may be what cooled it down a bit. Let's go to the 6th conference here, the one we'll go through, and the SEC. David, obviously, if you're talking football, you'd be talking Auburn, Alabama. I don't think that's what we talk about in basketball, though.
Well, the SEC's been odd because you have a lot of heat in the conference, but it doesn't seem to boil over on the basketball front because it's rare. While Auburn and Alabama have both been good at times, it's rare that they've been good at the same time. Ole Miss and Mississippi State, there was the 1 year they were both really good, and that was about it. So it seems like when you have your natural rivals, it's rare that they're both good at the same time. And what you kind of end up with is Kentucky being the showcase home game. And Kentucky and Florida, is that – I just don't really see – it just doesn't seem like the basketball rivalries that you would expect to flourish have really flourished here. And I think it gets just back to it ultimately not meaning anything on paper most of the time.
If you look at the past decade in the SEC, there can be no question Kentucky and Florida is the top rivalry.
Top series.
Florida has 2 national titles.
But again, it kind of gets back to how do you define a rivalry? That's definitely the showcase series in the conference, but is that the biggest rivalry?
Well, Tytel, what are your thoughts? Is it Kentucky, Florida?
It's Kentucky against the rest of the conference. In the Billy Donovan era, when they were winning back-to-back titles, it was certainly blue blood against blue blood. Now I think it's really Calipari and everyone else. I mean, when you don't lose at home ever, it's hard to develop a rivalry because part of a rivalry is that both teams can be competitive. If it's one-sided, it becomes a very boring rivalry. A fun fact of the night: Kentucky-Arkansas play next weekend would feature a 12-2 Wildcat team against a 13-1 Arkansas team. When is the last time Kentucky played an SEC team with a better record than them?
Hey, good point. Let's go through a couple other conferences real quick here. And the American, where David, let me start with you here. Central Florida and UConn. We know about the civil conflict. But is there a great rivalry in this conference, even given what a mishmash it has become?
If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
UCF UConn. No, it's really hard to say, and I think this is one of the leagues where a lot of the rivalries were kind of carved up. You've got pieces of the SEC left over. I'm really not seeing one that's big. If I had to choose one, Cincinnati-Memphis maybe. But I'm having a hard time finding one here.
I think that's a rivalry if you go back to the days of the Great Midwest and also the Metro. But I would also argue that Cincinnati and UConn may be more of a showcase, but certainly UC fans will remember just how devastating their last loss to UConn was back in March.
Yeah, and you could go back to the old Southwest Conference days with SMU Houston, but it just doesn't have that feel in the basketball court. John T., how about the Atlantic 10? There we've got some teams that have been together longer, although with Temple no longer in the conference, Temple-UMass was a great rivalry for many years.
I remember when one Hall of Fame coach, John Chaney, wanted to kill the UMass coach. One of the all-time great press conference moments.
Yes.
In terms of the present day, I like the fact that Dayton and VCU have had some recent success in March, so that would be my pick. Not that they have any history at all, I don't think. And then as a Big Five guy, I love LaSalle St. Joe's, but I love Temple St. Joe's a lot more, frankly.
I think if we're talking about Dayton, I have to give a shout-out to our friends in the Blackburn Review. Dayton and St. Louis, the Arch Baron Cup.
Arch Baron Cup.
I mean, if you want to talk about some of the more unwatchable basketball games from last year, the Dayton at St. Louis game, I mean, I wish I could pull up the recap. It was pretty epic.
David, I'll throw one over to you, though. How about VCU and Richmond, a couple old colonial rivals now in the A10 together?
Yeah, that one's pretty heated, and I think VCU GW has some heat to it, too. The A10, it seems more like a cluster than it does a conference, very much like the American, but without football. And it's kind of frustrating because I want to see the A10 do well. It's a basketball-centric conference, but it just can't seem to get out of its own way. And there's some good programs in here. Dayton, good program. You know, not Temple anymore, but VCU, a good program. Richmond has potential. You know, St. Joe's has had some good years, but it just seems to be, for the most part, a little bit of blah, a whole lot of fluff here throughout the whole team.
Let's start with another team that's full of blah, another conference full of blah. John Titel, is there a great rivalry in the Mountain West? I mean, some of these schools have been in the conferences with each other for a long time.
No and no.
Oh, there's one.
Across eras, I'd say maybe the 2010 San Diego State era with the 1990 UNLV era, but that's like the stretch. I mean, they have some good teams, and they have a lot of them located in the Mountain Time Zone. But that's about it. There's just nothing there that I'm seeing.
David, you had one?
Air Force, Colorado State, Wyoming, 3 Front Range teams right in Mountain West. We love the Front Range.
Okay, yeah. And Salika, we do discuss the West Coast Conference on these podcasts, so let's go over there. Is it Gonzaga St. Mary's, or is there something else here in the WCC?
I mean, it has been Gonzaga St. Mary's as far as the showcase for me, but I think the next rivalry after that is going to be Gonzaga and BYU. I mean, let's not forget, Gonzaga had to win a game at BYU just to stay within the NCAA picture at that time because they were still working to get the automatic bid.
Yeah, and this is a conference where these teams have all been in the conference. Most of these teams have been in the conference together for quite a while, long before Gonzaga became the name brand. But David, I just don't really see any heat there Maybe it's because Gonzaga, kind of like what John T said with the SEC, Kentucky versus everybody. This is Gonzaga versus everybody.
I think Gonzaga and St. Mary's was heated enough. Maybe it's cooled down some, but for a while, like when they had Dellavedova, it was pretty intense. And the games were well played. For a while, I thought it was one of the best rivalries on the West Coast. So I think it's definitely Gonzaga, St. Mary's as far as the heat goes. But, yeah, it is a one-sided. Gonzaga is definitely the alpha program in that rivalry.
I'll see your Dellavedova and raise you a Patty Mills and an Adam Morrison.
Yeah. There were years where, you could feel the energy of that game.
Well, John T, do you think it's back? It could be back this year when they play their two matchups?
I think there's a good argument to be made that Gonzaga-St. Mary's is the best rivalry game in a conference west of the Mississippi now. I mean, they're both top 20 teams who are playing fantastic. It had been Gonzaga and BYU for a while. St. Mary's, I think, has certainly in the past 2 years overtaken BYU, and obviously Gonzaga is not going anywhere. It's almost too one-sided, a la a team owning a conference like Kansas in the Big 12 or Kentucky in the SEC. But St. Mary's seems legit this year, and I think that we're not going to roll over against Gonzaga twice or three times.
I want to, at this point, go through a few of the upcoming games this week. We do have conference play kicking off starting Tuesday evening. 4 games out of the Big Ten: Northwestern, Penn State, Illinois, Maryland, Rutgers, Wisconsin, and probably the most intriguing one of them all, David, Michigan State at Minnesota. 2 teams that, one that's underachieving and one that's overachieving.
Yeah, Minnie's got a bloated record, but still they've done it mostly in home bye games. So it'll be interesting to see if they can get it done in conference. I was actually somewhat impressed with Rutgers the other night. I know they didn't win the game, but Seton Hall looks to be a tournament caliber team, and Rutgers went into that arena onto their floor, didn't win but competed, and it made me think, well, this is a team that I thought had done nothing other than win home bye games. Here they are competing with an NCAA tournament team on the road. Maybe they can make some noise in the Big Ten. And if they can defend their home floor and pick up some road wins, I'm actually looking forward to that Rutgers game.
Wow. Okay, I like that.
What do you think? You're the Rutgers guy, and
I think they're going to get crushed by Wisconsin tomorrow. Quite honestly.
Really? Okay.
Stalika, American starts off with a single game also. 2 teams that we haven't quite figured out yet, SMU and Memphis tomorrow as well.
I think we expected SMU to be somewhat good, although I think Memphis we probably figured was going to be about a year or 2 away. Had they been able to beat Monmouth, they probably would be sniffing the top 25. Oklahoma, that was a nice win on the road, but this may be one of those years where they don't get quite as much credit for winning a game like that as they should.
And coming up Wednesday night, Titel, I know there's some football on in the lake and there's some pretty good games on, but I'd recommend everybody turn on ESPN2 and don't change the channel. Virginia at Louisville, followed by UCLA at Oregon.
They're both going to be fantastic. Now that Oregon is at relatively full health with Dylan Brooks after his summer injury, I hope they know how to run because UCLA is going to put up at least 80, if not 100 points, even though they're on the road in Eugene. And Virginia and Louisville is going to be fantastic. Again, I don't think this was mentioned on the ACC. There's 2 great coaches and great teams. It's just a matter of getting Louisville acclimated to the ACC. This could, I hope, develop into a long-time rivalry. Louisville's amazing at home, so I'm going to give them the edge, but it should be a pair of great games, like you said. And
David, you're the under-the-radar guy, one of the under-radar guys here. Couple of non-conference games that are worth watching. Monmouth at North Carolina, UNC Wilmington at Clemson coming up Wednesday night.
Yeah, UNC Wilmington and Clemson is going to be a great game. Clemson getting, I think, their signature win of the year so far at North Carolina. It kind of defines them as a tournament caliber team. Wilmington looking for something like that. So these are 2 teams that are looking for signature wins. It's going to be really good. Monmouth, obviously, if they pull off this win, we're not talking about them as maybe being on the bubble if they win out anymore. We're talking.
I'll tell you this right now. We are not editing this podcast because I can tell you point blank, Clemson in their lifetime has 0 wins at North Carolina, but I'm sure you meant South Carolina.
I said South Carolina. We got to go back and edit that.
So let me stick with you for a second.
We got to go back and edit that.
You being a Big East guy and from the Cincinnati area, let me throw 3 games at you. First of all, 2 Big East games, Providence at Xavier, Seton Hall at Creighton, and then crosstown there, Cincinnati's at Temple as well in the American.
Let's not forget that Temple also swept Cincinnati last year. I mean, what they did to get in the tournament last year, they racked up wins against the top of the American, but what ultimately endangered them, but at least put them closer to the bubble, was losing to the Muck in that conference. I mean, I think Cincinnati's going to be out for some revenge, but watch out for that Seton Hall Creighton game.
David, coming up Wednesday, probably only one game of note Wednesday. That's this Florida at Arkansas game out of the SEC.
Yeah. Both teams looking pretty good. Arkansas a little bit better than I expected. We'll see what we can do because, again, it's teams that look like they have potential that are looking to establish themselves, so something in it for both of them.
And coming up on Friday, actually, the Big 12 has a bunch of games, including West Virginia at Oklahoma State, Texas Tech at Iowa State, Kansas at TCU. But, John T., another Pac-12 game coming, a couple Pac-12 games late. USC's at Oregon and Arizona is at Cal.
I'm not too worried about Cal. I probably should be. I'm not staying up because it's an 11 o'clock start, so I'll find out the next day. The Kansas-TCU game, I think, is when we find out how fraudulent TCU is. The West Virginia-Oklahoma State game is going to be amazing. Leading scorer in the conference, Juwan Evans, playing at home against West Virginia. 4 o'clock Eastern start on a Friday. We'll see how the players are feeling. I think it's going to be a great matchup. I'm going to go with Huggins, but I'm going to go with Huggins.
One other game I'm going to circle here for Friday, keep an eye out for, is the non-conference South Carolina at Memphis. Not sold on South Carolina yet, and this could be a trap game for them.
Yeah, for sure.
Saturday, Stalika, your Xavier Musketeers are at Georgetown now. We've got Duke at Virginia Tech. We've got Villanova at Creighton, some great games there. Florida State at Virginia as well. But probably the highlight game, David, is going to be Louisville at Indiana in probably the last key non-conference game before we get to the SEC Big 12 Challenge.
Yeah, exciting series here. Louisville, Indiana, actually closer in proximity than Louisville and Kentucky are. They don't normally play. They've played on occasion, but it's not a regular game. Should be. I mean, I wish it was, and I'm glad they're playing this year. We'll see what happens. Games up in Indianapolis, which is further away from both campuses than each other's campus, I think.
They all pale in comparison to the Granite State rivalry coming up on Saturday.
Ooh.
Yes, New Hampshire and Dartmouth coming up. Titel, you're shaking your head.
Can't believe you just skipped over Villanova Creighton. I'm glad you mentioned them, but it's not the showcase game of the day. It's like the showcase game of December. They're both undefeated. What do you want?
Okay, I'll give it to you.
Thank you.
Let's just hope it's better than Xavier and Villanova from last New Year's Eve.
I guess my feeling here is at the end of the day, I think Louisville and Indiana are better teams than Creighton at the end of the day. And I actually expect Villanova to win this game. Probably
not until February.
8 to 10 points. But a few other games here coming up on Sunday. Includes Michigan at Iowa, Minnesota at Purdue. We've got Ohio State at Illinois on the Big Ten, Providence at Butler, and Marquette at Seton Hall in the Big East. But, David, the game of the day, Sunday, maybe the game of the weekend, even bigger than Villanova Creighton, 2 p.m., FS1 on Sunday, St. John's at DePaul.
Yes, the Big East is bringing out the heavyweights early in the season, and the reason they're doing that is because they want to capture interest early and then hope it carries on as the season continues. So St. John's and DePaul, the 2 biggest markets going at it, and it's St. John's and DePaul. It's the 2 biggest markets going at it.
But Titel, if that's not the biggest game of the day between 2 absolutely awful teams, maybe Syracuse-Boston College is the biggest game of the day between 2 awful teams.
The biggest game of January 1st is Minnesota traveling to Purdue. They might be 13-1 if they can get by the Spartans. They played 1 road game. They lost it, granted, to Florida State, who's a very good team. I think Purdue is going to destroy Minnesota. But if Minnesota wins that game, they are making the NCAA tourney.
Wow.
If we're going to be talking about Allstate Arena, we need to shout out to our colleague Matt Sikowski right now. He's probably going to be attending the most well-attended event there this year. It's not a DePaul game. It's WWE Raw.
Yeah, shout out to Matt. He's at there. One of the games Sunday, we mentioned rivalries earlier. We mentioned the Colorado-Utah rivalry. That game is coming up Sunday as well. But on that note, let's go through any final thoughts here. And Stalika, let me start with you.
I know we're not really going to be doing under-the-radar rivalries here, but I think we have to include Harvard and Yale if we're looking at a recent success in the Ivy League, and I would expect no less from that rivalry this year.
Oh, well, actually, we're going to be doing that on Wednesday night, so we will be. But you can save Harvard, Yale. But Tytel, let me throw it up to you. And I know you, since you probably won't be with us for Under the Radar, you probably want to send a little love to another Ivy League rivalry too.
I mean, I love Penn Princeton, and hopefully we can get it done this year, but I'm not holding my breath. My thought is about Auburn, of all places. We touched on them briefly that they beat UConn in overtime on Friday. Tigers are 3-0 in their last three. Everson, 17-year-old, 6'11", 255-pound freshman Austin Wiley became eligible. He graduated high school a semester early and said, I'm ready. I can join the SEC in December. Let's do it. He's eligible, he's playing, he's contributing, and they're winning. It could be the start of a new phenomenon. Some people are phrasing it as a 1.5 and done. You graduate high school semester early, you play starting in late December to finish out your freshman year, then you play another year before you go to the draft. So it gives you a little extra seasoning. I hope it works for him and for others because it could be the start of a big phenomenon. We'll see.
David.
My final thought is, I don't know. I have no final thoughts. I think you did an excellent job tonight, Chad. You covered everything.
Well, I clearly was not wrong then.
We're saving this.
But my final thought, and Stalika, you mentioned this already, but coming up December 31st, coming up New Year's Eve, Dartmouth and New Hampshire, the Granite State rivalry, the Live Free or Die, Go Dancing or Die rivalry, the team of the people.
Yes.
UNH, we did get it confirmed. We got things done here at Hoops HD.
We get things done.
Saturday, December 31st has been declared a state holiday. All state offices in the state of Vermont will be closed in order that people may go to this game and for no other reason.
Right, and that's our gift to you. I mean, we actually called and they had told us, well, that's a state holiday. There you go.
Yeah. So that's the game everyone should be watching. After that, you might want to turn on that Villanova Creighton thing that Tytel was talking about. But on that note, on behalf of, let's see, we got John Stalika over there. We got David Griggs down here now, I think. Tytel over there, or wherever everyone is. I want to thank you all for joining us. We hope you all had a wonderful holiday or holidays going forward. And safe and happy New Year. We'll talk to you again at Surface Hoops HD Report next year.